And welcome back to another video with dee'stuition. Today's video is AQA Power and Conflict Poetry, Ozymandias. You will need a notepad and pen so that you can take notes throughout the video. Also, I'd advise going back and rewatching the video, adding to your notes, and just sort of picking up all of the information possible and adding your own thoughts and ideas. Don't forget, this is poetry, so it is very interpretive, so you can always add your own ideas onto mine. Let's get into it. Okay, so let's go into the overview of the poem. So we have a speaker who recounts what he was told by somebody else regarding the statue of a well-known king. Now, because of course this poem is set in ancient Egypt, which we'll look at on the next slide, we know that that king would have also been known as a pharaoh. So the statue is now in ruins, which is a stark and huge contrast to the way that the king was regarded during the time that he was alive and during his cruel reign. As well as this, we know that the statue was built as a reminder of the importance and the dominance that the king had. But little more than a pedestal remains, and the poem specifically says that the pedestal is there, but we know that most of the rest of the statue is laying in ruins. And overall, within the poem, there are ideas about nature versus man, which many of the AQA Power and Conflict poetry features. But as well as that, it's also about the futility of power, that power does not last forever, power cannot last forever, no matter how strong and dominant we feel that we are. So that's the general overview of the poem. As for the context of the poem, then, very specifically, pharaohs were the kings of ancient Egypt, and ancient Egypt is where Ozymandias is set. Hence why at the very beginning of the poem it talks about that antique land. In hieroglyphics, pharaoh means great house or palace, and these sorts of words let you know just how highly regarded pharaohs were. But of course, being that highly regarded, having that much power is always going to play into one's ego. So therefore, it makes perfect sense why Ozymandias had such a huge ego, why he had such a big idea of self-importance, and why he treated people the way that he did, and why he was able to get away with that. In reality, pharaohs headed the government, also the army. They set the taxes, they judged criminals, they were the high priest. Essentially, they were in charge of pretty much everything. Nobody was above them. There was nobody to tell them that they were wrong. There was nobody to chastise them. And again, that feeds into this idea of having a huge ego and being able to essentially do exactly what you want to do. The pharaohs are or were well known for their creation of famous Egyptian monuments. Most people do know, of course, about the pyramids and things like that. They didn't actually do the work themselves, though. Now, they didn't exactly have slaves, pharaohs didn't. However, the people that did build these monuments for them worked extremely hard. It was extremely hard labor. It wasn't pleasant, and it wasn't something that they would have been recompensed for very much. So, though they weren't officially slaves, you could, in a way, say that pharaohs did have slaves, or they certainly had ownership over people and the ability to make people do things and build things that they didn't have the capacity to do themselves. So, of course, if we relate that to the poem, the statue of Ozymandias that was built, of course, would have been built by people, slaves pretty much. And Ozymandias would have just been there giving out instructions on what he wanted to do, where he wanted things to be, and so on and so forth. Okay, so let's look at some key quotations from the poem. Now, my advice to you is to know 5 key quotations like the back of your hand from each of the poems that you are revising for. 5 key quotations should get you through any exam situation that you find yourself in and should be able to respond to any exam question. So let's get into the quotations that I've chosen. The first one is, I met a traveller from an antique land. Now, I really want us to focus on this adjective antique. It really gives connotations of how precious, of how rich, of how rare this land is. And it really shows how Ozymandias should have been treating the land as well as the people from the land with so much more respect than he did. What he chose to do instead, though, was focus on his own self-importance rather than the importance of the land and that nature. And it really feeds into this idea of irony because, of course, by the end of the poem, all that's really left is the antique land and very little is left of Ozymandias or his legacy. The second quote is half sunk and shattered visage lies. Now, of course, there's a lot of sibilance within that quotation there. You've got that repetition of that S sound, and it really highlights that there is very little left of this statue that can actually identify the person that it was made for. Now, of course, statues are erected to respect and revere somebody, but if that face, that visage is shattered, then it is very unlikely that anybody will even know who it is for. So therefore it has the opposite effect and shows a real disrespect for that person rather than a respect for them. The third quotation, sneer of cold command, and it's quite alliterative there with that cold command, and that really highlights how Ozymandias treated people when he was alive, and he ensured, or he tried to ensure, that the statue itself even represented that cold command that he had over people. And again, it links to this idea of, well, of course, nobody was going to take care of the statue once he was gone because he didn't take care of anybody while he was alive because he was such a cold, commanding person. The fourth quotation, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Now, here we have that imperative. Even written on a pedestal, he's still trying to tell people what to do. He's still trying to intimidate people. He's still trying to make people feel lesser than. Now, of course, this is his last words. These are the words that are supposed to live on beyond him actually being alive. And it just goes to show that even his last words are cruel words and linking with that quote prior to this of that cold command. He didn't like people to feel that they were on the same level as him, and he wanted to always remind them that they were beneath him and that they were supposed to fear him. And the final quotation, nothing beside remains. And you've got this really short sentence here, but it's so impactful. And it just really goes to show that there's nothing left of him. There's very little left of this person that was so important and that felt that they were so important and needed a statue of themselves built. Nothing besides remains. And again, it's ironic, isn't it, that he built this statue to be respected, to be always remembered, to basically be able to live forever, and yet there's barely anything there. So quite the opposite has happened. So in terms of the takeaways from this poem, and Ozymandias is one of my favourite poems, and I think one of the easiest ones for students to remember because there's so much to it and it's so relatable. This idea of people having egos and this idea of self-importance, which is so relevant to the modern world. But these are the overall takeaways that I would say that you need to take from this poem. The first one is that equilibrium will always be restored in the end. Ozymandias threw things off balance by constantly wanting to be above people, by constantly treating people terribly, by constantly being a tyrant. And by the time he dies, people forget all about him and his reign, and therefore the balance has been restored, the equilibrium has been restored, and nature does that. Secondly, is this idea about irony. You think you're really important, people can think they're really important and powerful, but essentially it can't last forever. And as much as people may fear you when you're alive, as soon as you are gone, that fear is all out of the window. Thirdly, you've got this idea of nature versus man. Nature will always be more prosperous. Nature will always be more powerful. No matter how many things we want to build to represent how amazing we are, just like Ozymandias did. Essentially, if nature wants to, it can wipe out every single thing that we decide to build, whether that is through snow, whether that's through the sea, like tsunamis and things like that. In the case of the poem, whether it's through the sand, but essentially nature can always take over, and it's a constant reminder of that. There's also the idea of the underdog rising up. Now, the people, the very same people that Ozymandias used to treat terribly, by the end of this poem, have actually somehow managed to get their own back. They have managed to sort of wipe him out of history because nobody remembers him anymore and nobody's keeping that statue protected. Nobody respects him enough once he's gone to look after that statue for him. And the final takeaway is that reputation expires. No matter how amazing you feel you were, how powerful you feel you were, how strong you feel you were, that cannot last forever. Eventually, people will forget about you. Physical representations, however, far exceed reputation. So if you have a physical representation of who you were, for instance, in this case, a statue, and nobody is treating it well and nobody is looking after it, it really, really goes to show that essentially people didn't have that respect for you in the beginning, and it was all based off fear. And what people will see is how people treat the statue rather than this amazing reputation that you once had. And that's all. What I will say as well, though, is of course you will have your own ideas on this poem. Poetry is definitely interpretive. You can mix your own ideas with mine as well as your teacher's ideas, but this is just to give you that overview of the poem, to help you do revision, and I really hope it helps. If there's anything else you want to know about the poem, do drop me a comment below and I will do my best to answer any of the questions that you have. Okay, thank you.